what allows for child welfare workers to do the job is something called the Child, Youth and Family Services Act. And through that act, it's a legal document, just like how you have the Criminal Act of Canada, it's a legal document, and that's what guides or facilitates the work. It's that legislation, and again, that legislation doesn't speak to the African Canadian family. It doesn't take into play the issues around the imbalance in power dynamics. It doesn't take into play the historical trauma that African Canadians have lived through. It doesn't take into play the issues that they face in terms of trying to have strong employment so that they can service and provide for their children. It doesn't take into account that although you may be a Black couple who has 2 children and you're both highly educated, or you're not highly educated, because it really doesn't matter, you're still trying to do the best you can with what you have so that your children can live a good, positive life, and also that if you are not here, they can continue to survive. That is part of being African Canadian, that when you get up every day, that's part of what you're doing. If I'm not here, can my children survive, right? And that's where then your white counterpart may be passionate versus you're aggressive, or she may be organized, or those parents may be organized versus you're militant and strict, right? That's just 2 simple things, but that's the narrative that gets developed when you're African Canadian versus if you're not, right? So that doesn't help when African Canadian families are entangled in the child welfare system, because even before they open their mouth, there's already a narrative that's been written about them or that's been thought about them. And it's how do those assumptions then play through it all of the work. So we're gonna look here. Black kids are kept in CAS longer. Why are there so many Black children in foster and group care? Crisis in children's aid over numbers of Black youth in care. Why good data means that Black youth in foster care. What good data means for Black youth in foster care. Indigenous Black children overrepresented in foster care and group homes, inquiries say. Discredited mother risk hair testing program harmed vulnerable families reported. Too many Black youth, Indigenous kids in Ontario child welfare systems report fines. So the 2 highest groups of children that are in care are Indigenous and Black across this entire province. And depending on where you are in the province, it might be only Indigenous, and that's if you're going further up north, versus when you're closer down into the GTA and across the southern section, there's a pretty unfortunate balance between being Indigenous and Black. So like I said, in the city of Toronto, 8% of the population is Black, 41% of that population, their children are sitting in care, versus 50% of the population in Toronto is white, and 37% of that 50 are sitting in foster care. So so if you're Black, you're 5 times more likely to be in foster care versus if you're white, it's not even 1%. So how did that happen? So we look here, contrast the newspaper in 1976, and we look at, this is literally different stories and ads in Black community newspapers on kids being in care and needing of Black foster homes, thinking that is the answer to having Black youth in care. That's not the answer to having Black youth in care. The answer would be, how do we get them out of care, or how do we keep them out of care, not let's have homes to house all these Black children we keep putting in our care. And it took over 40 years for this project to come together, the One Vision, One Voice, to be established and to address these issues of overrepresentation and the scooping of Black youth. Everybody's known about something called the 60s scoop. Now they have the millennial scoop, but no one ever really labeled or named the scooping of the Black children that have come into care. Right? When you're sitting with 41% of your children in care, that is an awakening number. And unfortunately, when those numbers were released from the Toronto Star via the CIS of Toronto, you would think there would have been this uproar from the Black community. But there wasn't. There was silence. And it was just like, well, why is there this silence? Like, our children are not at home. A good chunk of our children are not at home. And when we say 41%, we're talking about children where both of their parents are Black or one of their parents are Black. And there was no outcry. There was no demands, no marching, just, okay, we already knew that. And you have to sit and wonder, why was there no outcry? Why would there have been no outcry? Let's see if someone can answer that for me. Yes. Okay. Okay. So she had said that the reason why there was no outcry is because people probably felt helpless, and they probably felt like it wouldn't have made a difference. Yes.
I think for the families whose children are in care, there is such a level of embarrassment that they don't quite know where to go from there, and those whose children are not in care sometimes don't appear to care to give a damn.
So she said that for families who have had their children removed from their care, there's such an embarrassment that they don't want to say anything. And for the families who have not been affected by child welfare, it's not my problem, so I don't care. Yes.
There's a perception that especially women, that we are blessed.
Yes.
We are trying to be a servant.
Yes.
And so you come to a point where you say, why not?
Yes.
Because whatever I say is going to be interpreted as
Aggression.
aggressive.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I see it because I taught
Mm-hmm.
I taught in the school, and this is what happens to our children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As soon as they do something that's aggressive.
Yes. So we're aggressive. Yeah. Yeah. So we're aggressive. And so if we do stand up and say something, it's not even listened to, it's just heard. It's just another black body being aggressive. So no one's gonna listen to us, so then what's the point? Because like she said, if your white counterpart is to do it, they're listened to, the media is there, there's this outcry, there's the disbelief. But if it's us, it's just that we're aggressive. And they're always complaining about something. Yes?
The fact that I think for folks who aren't affected by the child welfare system, I think a lot of it too is they believe that it's justified. Like they think that these numbers make sense for our community, and that's how systemic anti-Black racism works,
Continues
right?
to work,
it
yes.
continues to work in that way when it's justified. I mean, that's how Black people are. We don't take care of our children. We don't do this. We don't do that, and that's how it gets perpetuated. So. I was just chatting with my colleague Frida. It's like, I don't know if there was silence. Like, it'd be interesting to see what you mean by that, because there was, I did see anyway downtown, like there were, you know, some protests, some calls to action. So yeah, I think it's that sometimes we know that there's a problem. We know there's disproportionate rates. So I don't think it was full silence, but I think a lot of it too in the Black community is like, we know this stuff. Like, so it's not really on us to fix it. Like it's, you know, so I think there's twofold there.
Yes. So she was saying, for one, there are going to be parts of the community that think it's justified. We already know the numbers. And although there was some protesting, it's not like the way other marginalized communities are able to protest, have their voice heard, be collectivized, to get out there to make people listen and want to make the change. But a lot of it is around it's justified, that's what they deserve. They're not taking care of their kids, so somebody has to do it. Meanwhile, we are taking care of our children, even if it means the mothers and the fathers don't eat or don't sleep as much or are working 2-3 jobs. We are taking care of our children. Now, nothing's perfect, but we are doing it, yes.
I think a large part of it has to go back to the way that we're portrayed in in media and society and everything. But I mean, when you think about, for example, what's going on with Trudeau and the natives up in, I think it's Alberta, and he's building a pipeline, I mean, arguably you could say that they're being silent because the media is not covering it. And I think that plays a large role in like why it seems as though we're silent, even though there have been protests, the same way other marginalized communities come together.
Okay. So we're gonna move on. So one thing I wanted to mention is these numbers came out in 2014. It is 2019. The Project for One Vision, One Voice started in 2015, and it's a project that's not permanent. It's a funded project, and again, like I said, the funding ends March 31st. So, like, I know one person had emailed and said, oh, they're gonna be summer sessions. No, they're not going to be summer sessions because the funding's not there to continue the position in order for this to happen. So that's why we're really trying to charge out into the community and get this done now, between now and the end of our funding, so that the knowledge is there. So this is what some of our Black youth have had to say in terms of the internalized anti-Blackness, the lack of community, so where our kids are being placed. I know I've worked with youth who are placed in places like Arthur. I don't know where Arthur, Ontario is. I know it's far away. They're placed out in, what's that other, there's a place that's like art there. Well, they're placed very far away. Like you'll have kids that are, say, maybe from high priority neighborhoods, that's what they call them in Toronto, that are then placed out in like at the end of Oshawa in Durham region, or they're placed in North Brampton or in some part here in Mississauga where they may not see people that look like them. And they may be in foster homes where the people in charge of them don't look like them. And so the people that don't look like them then don't know how to manage, say, their skincare, don't know how to manage their hair care, don't know what culturally appropriate foods to give them, what not to give them, may not be listening to the importance of what their mothers and their fathers and their aunts and their uncles mean to them. And you have these kids then who are growing up in a system, if they never go back home, they then lose out on a whole part of their identity. And no one's there to show them, no one's there to teach them. And that's not their fault. And in some cases it may not, and well, most cases, it's probably not the fault of the parents either. It's a system who's for whatever reason is taking the child because there's so much more spotlight and over surveillance on the Black community, period. So we talked about like the cultural and racial biases, not being able to expand their horizons, not having a sense of community, not feeling empowered or accepted as themselves. So if you have, say, children who are biracial versus a child who's Black, you may find that the biracial child, because they're lighter, is treated better versus a child who both parents are Black and who maybe have a darker skin tone. And then also, they don't have any type of, even if you can't get to a service, they don't even have, say, the technology to be able to find things on the internet or some type of, say, vlogs or video connection to be able to be a part of something. Especially the further north you go, there's less of it because there's just less resources, period. Right? Versus if you're here in the GTA. And if you're here in the GTA and there is service, guess what also comes along with that service? Waitlist. So therefore you have these kids in your care, they're Black children in your care, you're not Black, you don't know, you've put this child in a program, but they're on a wait list. So by the time their name comes up, they may be too old for the program, they may no longer live with you, which means they could have gone home, which is what we hope for, or the placement could have break down and they're now somewhere else, which means they now have to start all over again. So we look at the adoption of our children without mothers and parents' knowledge, and this has happened where parents are continuing to go to court to hopefully win their children back, and they come to find out through reading court docs or having court documentation explained to them, your child's up for adoption. So imagine reading on a piece of paper, your child's up for adoption, and we have somebody who can take your child and we believe will take better care of your child than you ever did. And this is what some of these parents that you're going to be working with face. Whether it's the PO, whether it's settlement agencies, the school board, these are what these parents are facing. Then we look at, say, the arrest of Black mothers and the parents refusing to let their babies go. Having to see a child ripped out of a mother's arms is one of the most horrific things you will ever see in your life. Thankfully, I've never seen it, but I've had files where that happened and then mom had been arrested for whatever and the child sitting somewhere waiting for me to come and get them. And then CAS offering Black teens more freedom than what they had at home. So here's a question. Why is it dangerous for a 13-year-old, anywhere between 13 and 16-year-old Black male to be out at 11 o'clock at night, no matter where you live? Why is that dangerous? Yell it out. Yeah. Profiling, carding, you fit the description, being stopped by police. Years ago when my godbrother was a teenager and he lived in a priority neighborhood, walking home off the bus from his Valentine's Day date, stopped by police and thrown on the cop car. He fits the description. So when we have our children in care and they're living in a home where the foster parents are not Black and every other child in the home has an 11 o'clock curfew, they get that 11 o'clock curfew too. Then if they go home, they want the 11 o'clock curfew. When mom and dad says, no, you need to be in here by 9:30, or you need to be in here by the time the sun goes down or those street lights come on, or you need to be in here before I sit down to watch the news at night. And the kid's like, oh, I want to go back to care then. In care, I had all this freedom. In care, I got my Jordans. In care, I could get my hair done every couple of weeks. In care, I could do this. I could do whatever I wanted. So if these children do get the chance to go home, like my friend over here said, the fabric of that family is no longer what it once was. Because the child's been introduced to things that do not fit them for safety reasons that they're not going to understand in the mind of a teenager. So that's the community that's part of the communal experience, which then that's going to lead to the fractured families, your fractured family cloth. It's going to lead to the trauma. It's going to lead to increased dependence on CAS, and it's going to increase the criminalization, and that's also what's then feeding into the VISAs, which are the voluntary youth service agreements. Because if the kid was previously in care, came out of care, went home, and now that CAS is no longer involved and they're 16, but because the law changed and now CAS in Ontario goes up to 18 minus a day, I'm going back to care, because in care I could do whatever I wanted. And now they've signed a voluntary youth agreement and they've got a place to live and they're getting their money every month and they're good to go. But when they realize those nurturing pieces are missing, their parents are the ones that have to swallow that hurt and that trauma to let them come back home and try to get back on track. Because don't forget, the system told the parent, we'll do a better job than you can. So child protection versus child welfare. They're two terms that get changed and used all the time, and they're actually two very different definitions. So child protection, it's very narrow, it's very rigid, it's focused on the legislation and rules. So it's focused back again on the Child, Youth and Family Services Act. It's compliance-based, problem-solving approaches and individual responsibility for the child's safety. So when we had our friends here in the room speak about the child welfare just kind of gets in and out, and they're just there to meet their compliance and keep moving on, this is what that's what it's talking about. They're talking about child protection. I'm a child protection worker. I have to meet my standards. I need to ensure I follow the legislation. So therefore, this is what I have to ask. This is what I have to do. And then I have to move on to my next family. That doesn't help anybody. And it makes families feel like just a number or just a name on a computer screen. Versus child welfare, which is based on family support and preservation, the inclusion of multiple perspectives, strength-based community-oriented preventative practices, and includes efforts to understand the broader systemic impact of the family. Do we see the difference? So I would say that I'm a child welfare worker because I want to figure out what is going on, what is working, what's kept you off of our radar for this long, what kind of maybe need to get rejigged so that you come off of our radar and we can close your file, and that your kids are safe, and that you're able to tap into the services that are in your community. Because that's where you're going to get the real help and support, right? A Children's Aid Society, yes, their bottom line is to ensure kids are safe. And so they take the referral that's going to come from the community, and they've got to kind of work to figure out, okay, so what's going on? But it can be done one of two ways. You can either do child protection and stick with your legislation, your rules, and your mandates, or you can try to do child welfare, where you still try to, stick to your rules, but you look more at the family for who they are. You fit the family instead of getting the family to fit you and the legislation that you have to follow. And hopefully that means you have a supervisor who supports that, because that's really important. So as we break down child welfare, we're going to look at it in 4 parts. We're going to look at the CYFSA. We're going to look at child protection, the standards and the tools, the eligibility spectrum, and then case files. And then we're going to get into some of the navigation stuff. So when you think of Children's Aid Societies and the image that represents the reasons to why a child comes into care, these are your reasons, right? Those are your reasons. They're being hit with a belt, which is assault with a weapon via the criminal code. There's too many kids in the home, or you're starting to wonder if they're meeting all their needs, or the kid's going hungry. But generally, they look like this, right? They don't look like their white counterparts. That's not, as the numbers again for Toronto show you, that's not what they're seeing. So race matters in child welfare, and we all know race is it's a construct that was created by those in power to have a system in place so they know who's at the bottom of the totem pole. And then depending on other intersectionalities, that's where you kind of start to move up and down. And so unfortunately, we interchange last place with Indigenous populations, depending on what the focus is, right? So race matters. So as we can see here, there are 539,205 African Canadian families in Ontario. They're making up 4% of the province's population. So 8% of the city of Toronto, 4% of the entire population of this province. And this is a large province. This is a huge province. So much that we actually sit in 2 different time zones, if no one knew that up north. That's how big we are. It takes 24 hours to drive across our province, right? Then you look at here, Stats Canada shows you by 2031, the African Canadian population will double its size. So although it may double its size, we are really gonna hope that through the work that we've done at One Vision, One Voice, and the knowledge we're leaving with the community, that our numbers in care do not double by 2031. Hopefully the number of 41% for Toronto and whatever the number is here in Peel and then York Region and all around this province, those numbers are ghost stories by the time 2031 comes around. Entry into the system and what that looks like for people. The significant differences in the way families are served, the significant differences on how long a file is open for, how families are serviced, what services are available, if their children come into care versus if they don't, how long their children stay in care versus their counterparts, entry into the system, and how quickly can you get out of the system? Can you get out of the system? There are some families who are in the system from day one straight to what used to be birthday number 16, which could now possibly be birthday number 18. And when a file's closing and your reason being child has aged out of mandate, we never want that to be the last sentence on a closing report. Being in the system. So that the fact that our Black youth stay in care longer, they don't know who they are coming out. The understanding they have about who they are may just be what they've seen on television, maybe what movies the facility plays. There was one youth who spent the majority of his time in care in institutionalized facilities, and they showed him gangster movies. So guess what he became when he came out of care? Because what did he identify with? Being a gangster. So guess where he is as an adult? In jail. Because that's all the child welfare system and his workers and the institution he sat in as a youth showed him. No one showed him individuals who were trying to make good in their community. No one showed him the Jamal Maglores who have foundations and the individuals that look like LeBron James who are paying for school so that Black youth have a place to go. Right? They showed him like Wesley Snipes in New Jack City. They showed him what is that one? Menace to Society. Like they showed him those type of things where that youth is not going to have any idea of what a positive Black man or Black woman can look like. Exiting the system. Let's see who can exit the system quicker. Because what do they have? They have the resources. The amount of times I come across a white family and they say, well, okay, you can come and speak with me. My lawyer will be present. Why do you need a lawyer for us to sit down and talk about your role in life as a father or a mother? What does that have to do with a lawyer? But because they have an understanding of their privilege and power in society, they know they have the right to state that to me. So I'm like, okay, fine, no problem. Because who am I as a Black worker to tell you, no, you can't bring your lawyer to come and speak with me about your role in life as a father or mother? And then I have to go and consult my legal counsel. Right? They have the resources. They're probably less likely to be arrested for something. They probably have a better understanding of how to work within the system to get out of it. And again, the narrative of them is that they're organized, they're passionate, they're concerned, they're good parents, versus their African Canadian counterparts who are militant, strict, aggressive. You see the difference in terms of how one person, how a worker could describe 2 different families? And even if myself and a white coworker to describe the same family, I know to use different language so that my family gets out of the system quicker. Where my coworker, based on how my coworker writes, those children may be apprehended. Okay. Yeah, might as well.
So around Toronto CAF, knowing what we know, I've heard a lot from bill, but I'm wondering what Toronto CAS is putting in place to try to offset this.
So at CAS Toronto, they have what we call anti-Black racism leads, one for every department, so there's 6 of them, who then consult with the workers on the families that they're working with to ensure appropriate service, to ensure trajectory is more positive than what it's been so far. There's also, the position currently is vacant, but Nicole Bonney, who is now the CEO of the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, was the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the Children's Aid Society of Toronto. There's also a Black Education Awareness Committee that works with the Black youth in care to give them community feelings, so doing educational Afrocentric-based trips every year, doing the Black History Month event to show some forms of education, Kwanzaa event. There is also, no, that's everything. Oh, then they're also working in a framework called Signs of Safety, along with an equity perspective and anti-Black racism lens, to help workers really start to change the way in which they ask questions and the way that they're working with their families to change the trajectory for families as well. So we're going to move into the Child, Youth and Family Services Act, which is now dated for April of 2018. And we're going to work our way through this lovely circle of the different parts of child welfare. So Child Welfare and Family Services Act states here 2017, but everything was written in 2017, and then all changes were made for April 1st. They came into effect on April 1st. So it governs all children's aid societies. It governs all child welfare or child protection. That is like, that's the book, that's the textbook, that is what we work from, just like for the individuals who say are police officers, they have the criminal code, this is what we work from. The Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services in Ontario funds all child welfare agencies in the province of Ontario, but then the agencies run themselves based on jurisdictional boundaries. So in the City of Toronto, there's 4. There is the Children's Aid Society of Toronto, Catholic Children's Aid Society of Toronto, Native Child and Family Services, which has a preventative component and a child welfare component, and then the Jewish Family and Child Services, which again has a preventative component and the child welfare component. The only other 2 jurisdictions that also have a second child welfare agency, York Region has York Children's Aid Society, and Jewish Family and Child Services covers both Toronto and York Region. And then Hamilton has the Catholic one versus also Hamilton CAS. And so this is where all of our legislation falls. It's where our mandate is created. And it's also then what's used, say, when families are at court. This is where the sections of the act are used to present the information to a judge. And also, so the CYFSA can just be found online. Literally just Google Child, Youth and Family Services Act, and the entire document will come up. And it's hyperlinked, so that if you want to know about a certain section, you click on that number and it takes you directly there. You don't have to continue to scroll through the whole document. But it's important to know that this act that CAS follows, it's to ensure child safety. It has, I think, close to 214 or just over 214 sections, but it's to ensure children are safe. But the purpose is to ensure best interest, safety, and well-being of children. So it's a document that's created with really good intentions to keep kids safe. But when you start to throw your intersectionalities on top of it and you look at it through an anti-Black racist lens, you start to see how it can be more harmful to the African Canadian family versus being more of a helpful tool. So the areas covered by the CYFSA are children's and young persons' rights, funding and accountability, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and family services. This is actually a new section of the Act that came in for April 1st. So about every 5 years, the CYFSA is looked at again, and there's amendments to it. But this was a very brand new section. So although the province talks about, oh, look what we've done, there's an overrepresentation, we have to do better by our Indigenous and Black populations, there's still nothing in the Act that actually speaks specifically to the African Canadian population, although there is some wording around anti-Black racism. It's still not the same. When you look through the CYFSA, you're going to see there are chunks of information that are brand new about the Indigenous population, and rightly so, they should be there. There's child protection, there's a section on youth justice, the extraordinary measures in terms of when children are in care or if children have been abandoned. The adoption and adoption licensing is also in there, residential licensing, and the personal information, which comes into effect January 1st of next year, which is the way in terms of how data is collected and in asking every person in the home, including children, about how they identify. So used to be by gender, religion, culture, and race. They've added a lot more pieces to ensure that they're getting a more whole picture of every individual. And then there's also miscellaneous matters. And so why is it important in understanding the Child, Youth and Family Services Act? Because it's an act that governs the work that child welfare workers do, okay? So when I go back to CAS Toronto, this is what tells me how I'm supposed to do my job. So it's important then as community-based agencies to get familiarized with, okay, so what is it that tells this woman and all of these other people how they're supposed to do their work, okay? Then also societies have a duty to support best practices according to the mandate of this act and will use it to justify their decisions. So it mandates me. And then when I do come across families who do start to ask questions, this is the document child welfare workers use to say, well, this is why I've made this decision. Okay, and then the understanding of the CYFSA is critical to providing support and advocating for families that are caught up within the child welfare system. So if you have an understanding of it, or you've gone through it and you've used it, and then you see that an agency is not using the 11 race equity practices, that's where then you can start to challenge and hold child welfare accountable to this family. Okay, so this is why it's important to know this particular document. Then we also have here, so the Child, Youth and Family Services Act, it came into effect, like I said, in April with the different provisions. So services provided to children and families should be child-centered. So it's always been about the best interest and safety and well-being of the child, but then this piece around child, you would think that child-centered then would be in there, but it hasn't. It hasn't. So when we talk about that, we talk about, well, what's in the best interest and are we actually listening to the child's voice? And when I say listening to the child's voice, yes, we have very young children. We're not going to listen to everything a 5-year-old has to say, but we are going to start taking that in consideration in terms of how are we planning for this child? Where are we placing this child? If we have a child who's saying, you know, I'm happy at home, or if they are in care and they say, I want to go to auntie or uncle so-and-so, are we looking at auntie or uncle so-and-so? Because if we're not being child-centered. We're not listening to that child's voice. Children and families have better outcomes when the services are built on their strengths. Again, having the society fit the family versus the family fitting the society's box. Because that's how they're gonna have better relationships. That's how these families are gonna have better relationships with their child welfare workers. Is the worker willing to get creative and really work with the family with their strengths? And then provide services for children and families with respect to the diversity and the principles of inclusion. So diversity means everybody in this room is invited to the dance, right? But inclusion means everybody's asked to come and dance. So just because you're put in the space, if you're silenced in the space or you're off to the sideline, you're still not included. But they can say, oh, they've been included, they were invited. No, you have diversified your room, but you did not include everybody in your room. So how do we ensure we're including the voices of these families? How do we ensure that their voices are being heard? And if it's that they have a hard time expressing themselves, then how are we ensuring that the individuals from community-based agencies like yourselves are helping to make sure their voices are heard so that they are included in their own decisions?